Hi, my name is Alyssa Hope, and today I'm going to be talking about collapsing margins in CSS. I know, it sounds thrilling. Collapsing margins is usually taught as an advanced lesson, but I think that we can give an informative, quick, and helpful talk on collapsing margins that's more geared towards the junior or intermediate level. So we're going to give it a try. The goals for this course, the overview for this course is that we'd be able to do an introduction to collapsing margins, talk about what they are, when they occur, and then do a walkthrough so that you can observe those behaviors. And then we'll talk about some best practices for dealing with collapsing margins. As for the goals for this talk, I want you to be able to identify when collapsing margins is affecting your layout. Just being able to do that much is going to be an awesome thing. And then to also learn some best practices that if you follow them, collapsing margins will never even be an issue. So that's the goal. As a quick refresher, we're going to talk about the box model real quick, because if you don't understand the box model, then nothing about collapsing margins is going to make sense. But we're going to do this quick. So, when I talk about the box model, I usually talk about picture frames, just to give people a visual. So, in picture frames, we have the content, which is the picture. We have space between that picture and its frame, which would be called the matting. And then we have the frame, and we've got some space between each picture here. In CSS land, the content is whatever the content of our, or the picture is whatever the content of our HTML element is. The padding of a CSS element is like the matting of a picture. The frame of a picture is like the border of a CSS or a HTML element. And then the space between that element and all of the other elements in your layout is the margin. So if you need to go back over that, right now would be a good time to do that, because we're going to move on to talking about collapsing margins. To do that, I'm going to give you a quick code walkthrough, just so you can see what's happening. So here, this is a pretty typical, really simple CSS and HTML layout. I've got a UL with some LIs over here, and a section with some divs, and then I've just got a tiny bit of styling, just enough to show what's going on here. So if we inspect this element, if you only knew the box model, you would calculate the distance between these two list items as the margin bottom of the first item and the margin top of the second item, which would mean that here, between these two items, we should have at least 35 pixels, or we should have exactly 35 pixels of padding. But if we actually measure between these two, assuming that I'm a little bit off, we actually have 24. And that doesn't make any sense. Really, I've come too far down on this one. So we have 20 pixels of padding, or 20 pixels of margin, excuse me. 20 pixels of margin is only the margin top of our first element. So if we take a look at this here, you can see that when I hover over this item, its margin top of 20 pixels comes all the way up to the bottom of the second item. Well, that does not follow with what we know of the box model. So we have a problem, and it can be a confusing problem if you don't know what you're looking for, because this margin has just gone and disappeared, or collapsed, as we like to say. It's not actually gone. If I hover over this item, you can see that its margin is indeed still there, and it is extending down. But there's this rule in CSS that when sibling elements like our LIs here or our divs here, when sibling elements have a margin bottom that touches a margin top, only the greater of the two will show up. So in this case, we have a margin bottom touching a margin top, and only the greater of the two, only the margin top, is actually showing up. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, really. It's not a problem. It's just that you have to know that this happens. Obviously, this isn't an issue for the very first item because its margin top is not touching any margin bottom. And same thing for this last item, its margin bottom is not touching any margin top. So those margins don't collapse. Same exact thing happens here with divs. And the confusing thing, I'm going to kind of show you what a lot of people run up against when they notice this. If I have these two divs, thing 1 and thing 2, I might want more space between the content of thing 1 and the content of thing 2. So to increase that margin, I might click on thing 2 and start to change its margin top, which would make sense. Except that no matter what I do, I can change this all day and nothing actually changes in my layout. Nothing moves. Until I pass the 30 pixels, and then immediately it starts to move. That's because the moment that this margin is greater than the margin, the 30 pixels of margin on thing 1, this becomes, the margin of thing 2 becomes the visible one. So that is collapsing margins in practice. It's something that I think a lot of junior developers will run up against, but then not really know why. And at least for me, I didn't come across this topic as an actual concept, or didn't see anyone write it down until I was more than 4 years into my career as a developer. So I thought it would have been helpful to have a long time ago. So coming back to our slides, some descriptions of what collapsing margins are. Chris Coyer has a really good one from CSS Tricks that when two block elements are stacked on top of each other, the vertical space between them is the larger between the one on top's margin bottom and the one on bottom's margin top. Might be simpler to say when a margin top and a margin bottom between two sibling elements touches, only the greater of the two shows up. So if you want to know a lot more about it, MDN, of course, is a fantastic resource. You can go there and read everything about when this does and doesn't happen, to what elements and when and why. That is the one place that collapsing margins does get a little bit hairy, is there are a lot of rules about when and to which elements collapsing margins applies. The big ones that stuck out for me about this are that if you choose a position option that is not relative, so let's say that you have an element that's positioned absolutely on your page, collapsing margins will not apply to that element. There are other cases where collapsing margins does not apply. And then primarily I come across this in sibling elements, that like the vertical space between two sibling elements is what collapses. But this also comes into play with child and parent elements, where if the margin of the child element extends past the margin of the parent, then it will collapse. So there are more rules definitely further into this that you can go. As far as resources, here are some really good ones that I found. Mastering margin collapsing just goes into a lot more detail, and then coping with it, the what's the deal with margin collapse one here is also really good. So that's about all the time that I have. Thank you very much, and I hope it was an informative little lesson. Happy coding.